She stood alone at the edge of the candle-lit ballroom, her champagne glass untouched, a smile painted on her lips that did not reach her eyes. The music swirled through Ashford Hall like a glittering waltz of silk and whispered secrets, and the whispers tonight were all about her. Look at her, standing there like a forgotten statue. His Grace has not even glanced at her once this evening. I heard he only married her to settle the old feud. A political token, nothing more. Eleanor Ashford, Duchess of Montcroft, heard every word. She had learned to pretend she did not. She had learned to keep her chin lifted and her eyes calm, even when her heart was cracking open behind her ribs. Across the polished floor, her husband, Alexander Montcroft, the Duke of Ashford, danced with the beautiful and recently widowed Lady Darlington. His dark head was bent close to hers. He smiled a smile Eleanor had never once received. The agony of it was not sharp. It was a dull, familiar ache, like a bruise that never healed. She had been his wife for 6 months. In that time she had become an expert in invisibility. She knew how to arrange her face into pleasant nothingness. She knew how to retire early without anyone noticing. She knew how to cry without making a sound. Tonight she had worn a gown of deep sapphire blue, hoping he might notice. He had not. When she had descended the staircase, he had glanced up from his pocket watch and said only, "The carriage is waiting." Not one word about her appearance, not one flicker of warmth. The waltz ended. Lady Darlington laughed, placing a gloved hand on the Duke's arm. Eleanor's stomach tightened. She turned away and slipped through the open terrace doors into the cool night air. The stars above Ashford Hall were indifferent and beautiful. She pressed her hands against the stone balustrade and let one single tear fall. Then she breathed deeply and fixed her mask back in place. She was, after all, a duchess, even if she was not loved. The memory of how it all began drifted through her mind like a half-forgotten dream. 6 months earlier, she had stood in the chapel at Thornwood, her hand trembling as the Duke slid a cold gold band onto her finger. He had not looked at her. He had stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his vows spoken with the same flat tone one might use to read a business contract. She had told herself it was nerves. She had told herself that love could grow, that patience and kindness could thaw even the coldest heart. She had been so very wrong. At the wedding breakfast, he had excused himself early to attend to estate matters. Her new mother-in-law, the Dowager Duchess of Ashford, had patted her hand and said, "Give him time, my dear. He has a good heart beneath all that ice." Eleanor had smiled and nodded, hope blooming foolishly in her chest. She had spent the first week at Ashford Hall arranging fresh flowers in every room, learning the names of the servants, and instructing the cook to prepare his favorite dishes. She had waited for him each evening in the drawing room, a book open on her lap, her heart leaping every time she heard footsteps in the hall. Most nights, he dined alone in his study. One evening she had gathered her courage and knocked on his study door. He had looked up from his papers, his gray eyes as unreadable as winter clouds. "Is there a problem, Your Grace?" he had asked, using her title like a wall between them. "I thought we might take tea together," she had said, her voice soft. "We have been married nearly a fortnight, and I feel I scarcely know you." He had set down his pen with deliberate slowness. "You know all that is necessary. I will provide for you. You will have the title. We need not pretend this is a love match." The words had struck her like a physical blow. She had stood there, her hands clasped tightly, her throat burning. "I had hoped we might at least be friends," she had whispered. He had returned his attention to his papers. "Friendship is a luxury for those who marry by choice, not duty. Now, if you will excuse me, I have work." She had left the room, walked to her bedchamber, and wept until her chest ached. But the next morning she had risen and tried again. She had smiled at breakfast. She had asked about his plans for the day. He had answered in clipped monosyllables and departed for the stables without a backward glance. The weeks that followed were a slow, grinding lesson in rejection. She hosted a small dinner party for his closest political allies, hoping to show him she could be a gracious hostess. She arranged the table herself, chose the wine, and greeted each guest with genuine warmth. He arrived 20 minutes late, his cravat slightly askew, and spent the entire meal discussing trade routes with Lord Hastings while ignoring her completely. When one of the ladies praised the flower arrangements, Eleanor had smiled and said, "Thank you, I arranged them myself." Her husband had not even looked up. The silence from his end of the table was louder than any applause. After the guests had departed, she had stood in the empty dining room, the scent of candle wax and wine lingering in the air. A footman began clearing the plates. She felt utterly hollow. She had given everything she had, and it had meant nothing. The final blow came on a rain-soaked afternoon in October. She had been searching for a book in the library when she noticed a stack of letters on his desk. She did not intend to pry, but her gaze snagged on her own name in his handwriting. Her heart pounding, she read the letter. It was addressed to his younger brother, Lord Julian Montcroft, who was traveling on the continent. The words were written in sharp, impatient strokes. "You ask after my marriage. Let me be plain, Julian, I never wanted this union. The Duchess is a necessary inconvenience, a burden I must bear for the sake of our family's legacy. She tries, I will grant her that, but her efforts only make the situation more tiresome. I count the hours until I can return to my old life. Do not envy me this gilded cage." The paper slipped from her fingers. She stood there frozen, the rain hammering against the windows. A burden, a tiresome inconvenience, a gilded cage. He had not even seen her as a person. She was merely a weight he was forced to carry. Something inside Eleanor broke that day. It was not a dramatic, screaming fracture. It was a quiet, final snapping of the thin thread of hope she had been clinging to. She returned the letter to its place, walked to her room, and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. When her lady's maid came to help her dress for dinner, Eleanor smiled and said she was feeling unwell. She did not go down to the dining room that night, and the Duke did not ask where she was. From that moment on, Eleanor stopped trying, not with bitterness but with a calm, deliberate acceptance. She would no longer chase a man who did not want her. She would no longer twist herself into shapes to please someone who only saw her as a duty. If she was to be invisible, she would be invisible on her own terms. She began to fill her days with purpose. The Ashford estate was vast, with dozens of tenant families living in conditions that ranged from modest to dire. Eleanor had always possessed a quiet intelligence and a deep well of compassion. She started visiting the cottages, accompanied only by her maid and a basket of bread and medicine. At first, the tenants were wary of the young Duchess, but she did not come with airs. She sat in their cramped kitchens, held their bobbies, listened to their worries about the harvest and the fever that had taken 3 children in the neighboring village. She remembered their names. She brought a physician from the county town and paid for his services out of her own allowance. Word spread quickly. The Duchess of Montcroft was kind. She was nothing like the cold, distant Duke. The tenants began to greet her with smiles and bunches of wildflowers. The village children would run to meet her carriage, chanting her name. For the first time since her wedding day, Eleanor felt something other than loneliness. She felt needed. She felt seen. She started a small school in an empty cottage near the village green. She taught the children to read and write, using slates and chalk she had ordered from London. She laughed with them. She knelt in the dirt to show a little girl how to plant marigold seeds. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Bellamy, became her friend and ally. The servants at Ashford Hall noticed the change in their young mistress. She was still polite and gentle, but there was a new quiet strength in her bearing. She no longer waited anxiously for the Duke's approval. She no longer lingered in doorways hopping for a kind word. The Duke, for his part, did not immediately notice. He was absorbed in his estate ledgers, his horses, and the endless political maneuvering required to maintain his family's influence. But slowly, in small ways, her absence began to register. Dinner became a silent, solitary affair. She had taken to eating early in a small parlor, claiming she preferred the light. The drawing room, which she had once filled with flowers and music, sat dark and unused. When he passed her in the hall, she would offer a polite nod and continue on her way. She no longer sought him out. She no longer asked about his day. The silence that he had once imposed upon her had become her armor. One evening, he arrived home earlier than usual. He walked through the grand foyer, expecting to find her in the sitting room with her embroidery. The room was empty. He found his butler and asked, "Where is Her Grace?" "At the village school, Your Grace," the butler replied. "She often remains there until dusk. Shall I send word that you wish her to return?" The Duke frowned. "The village school?" "Yes, Your Grace. The Duchess founded it herself. She teaches the children every day. The tenants speak of little else." He stood there, his glove still in his hand, an unfamiliar sensation prickling at the back of his neck. He did not know what to call it. It felt a little like being left behind. The first crack in his indifference came at the harvest fair. The Ashford estate held a small celebration each autumn, with stalls selling cider and pies and games for the children. Elinor had helped organize it, her gentle efficiency earning her the admiration of the entire village. She moved through the crowd, a simple muslin gown replacing her silks, her hair loosened by the breeze. She was laughing with a tenant farmer's wife, her face lit with genuine joy. The Duke observed her from a distance. He had not seen her laugh like that in months. He could not remember if he had ever been the reason for it. Then he noticed a man standing nearby. Mr. Henry Aldridge, the land agent from the neighboring Haverford estate. Aldridge was tall, sandy-haired, and possessed a warm, easy smile. He was speaking to Elinor, and she was listening with interest, her head tilted slightly. Something dark coiled in the Duke's chest. He recognized it with a jolt of surprise. It was jealousy, sharp, bitter, and entirely unwelcome. He strode toward them, his boots crunching on the dry grass. "Elinor!" His voice came out harsher than he intended. She turned, her expression cooling the moment she saw him. "Your Grace." The formal address stung. She had not called him Alexander since the first month of their marriage. Aldridge bowed politely. "Your Grace, I was just telling the Duchess about the new irrigation system we are installing at Haverford. She has some excellent ideas." "Indeed," the Duke said flatly. "I was not aware my wife had become an expert in irrigation." Elinor's eyes flickered, but her voice remained calm. "I have simply been listening to the farmers here. They know their land far better than I do. Mr. Aldridge has been kind enough to share his knowledge." "How generous of him!" The Duke's tone was ice. "I trust you will not tire yourself with too much estate business. After all, you have duties at the hall." Something flickered in her gaze, hurt, quickly masked. "I am aware of my duties, Your Grace. I have never neglected them." She gave a small, graceful curtsy. "Now, if you will excuse me, I promised Mrs. Bellamy I would help with the children's races." She walked away, her back straight, leaving the Duke standing there with Aldridge. The silence between the two men was thick. Aldridge cleared his throat. "She is a remarkable woman, Your Grace. The village has quite fallen in love with her." The Duke's jaw tightened. He did not reply. He simply turned and walked in the opposite direction, his heart pounding with an emotion he refused to name. That night he found himself standing outside her bedchamber door. He had not visited her room since the early days of their marriage, and even then it had been out of cold, distant duty. He had never stayed. He had never held her. Now he raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What would he say? That he had been a fool? That the sight of her laughing with another man had made him feel like he was drowning? The words would not come. He lowered his hand and walked away, the corridor silent and empty. The weeks that followed were a slow, painful unspooling of his composure. He began to watch her. He noticed the small things he had been blind to for so long. The way she bit her lower lip when she was reading, the soft humming she did when she arranged flowers, the way the servants' faces brightened when she entered a room. She had built a life without him. She had become the heart of Ashford Hall while he remained a cold, distant figure on its periphery. He tried, in his own clumsy way, to reach out. At a formal dinner with his aunt, Lady Prudence, the old woman made a cutting remark about Elinor's common charity work. Really, my dear, must you spend so much time among the dirt and the poor? It is most unbecoming for a duchess. Before Alina could respond, the Duke spoke. His voice was quiet but edged with steel. My wife's work is commendable. The tenant's welfare reflects directly on this family's honor. I will not have it disparaged. The table fell silent. Lady Prudence stared at him as if he had grown a second head. Alina looked at her husband with something unreadable in her eyes. It was not hope. It was too late for simple hope. It was a cautious, weary curiosity. Later that evening he found her in the library. She was standing by the window, gazing out at the moonlit gardens. He approached her slowly, his heart thudding. "Alina," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft, "I wonder if we might talk." She turned, her expression guarded. "Of course, Your Grace. What do you wish to discuss?" He flinched at the title. "Must you call me that, even now?" Something shifted in her face, a shadow of the old pain. "You taught me to call you that. You made it very clear that our marriage was a formal arrangement. I am only respecting your wishes." "My wishes have changed," he said, the words scraping his throat. She was silent for a long moment. Then she smiled, a sad, gentle smile that broke his heart. "It is too late for that, I think. I spent months trying to reach you. I left pieces of myself at your door and you never once picked them up. I cannot go back to that, I will not." She moved past him, her lavender scent lingering in the air. He stood alone in the library, the truth crashing over him like a cold wave. He had lost her, not through death or distance, but through his own relentless, foolish cruelty, and he did not know how to win her back. The breaking point came on a stormy evening in late November. Alina had been at the school later than usual, helping a sick child's family. She returned to the hall soaked and shivering. The Duke saw her from the window of his study, her small figure struggling against the wind. Something inside him snapped. He rushed to the entrance hall and met her at the door, his face pale. "You should have sent for the carriage," he said, his voice tight with fear. "You are drenched. You will catch your death." She looked at him, surprised by the intensity in his eyes. "I did not wish to trouble anyone." "You are never a trouble," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "You are he stopped, the word wife catching in his throat. She held his gaze, water dripping from her hair. "I am what, Your Grace? Your duty? Your burden?" The words were not spoken with anger, but with a quiet, devastating certainty. He staggered back as if she had struck him. "Where did you hear that?" "I read your letter to Lord Julian," she said, her voice trembling despite her strength. "I know what I am to you." His face went white. "That letter was written in the first weeks of our marriage, before I knew you, he could not finish. The truth was too enormous, too tangled with secrets he had sworn to keep." She shook her head slowly. "Words written in private are often the truest. I have accepted my place, Alexander. I have found my own peace. Please, do not disturb it now out of some sudden guilt." She turned and walked up the staircase, leaving him standing in the dark entrance hall, the rain hammering against the roof like a judgment. The next day, the Dowager Duchess arrived. Margaret Montcroft was a woman of sharp perception and even sharper tongue. She had watched her son's marriage from a distance, and she had seen enough. She found him in his study, staring at a ledger he was not reading. "You look like a man who has lost something precious and only just realized its value," she said, settling into a chair. He did not look up. "Mother, please." "Do not mother please me. I have kept silent long enough. That girl has been a saint. She has endured your coldness, your neglect, and the whispers of every gossip in the county, and she has done it with grace. Now I see her pulling away, and I see you panicking. Tell me why." He closed his eyes. "I cannot." "You can and you will. I am your mother, not one of your servants. What is this wall you have built around yourself?" The silence stretched. Then finally he spoke. His voice was raw, scraped clean of pride. "I have loved her almost from the beginning. From the moment she placed those ridiculous flowers in the dining room and smiled at me as if I were not a monster. and that is precisely why I had to keep her at a distance." His mother's eyes narrowed. "Explain." He rose and walked to the window. "Do you remember Lady Penelope Harwood, the woman I was once betrothed to before she jilted me for the Viscount Marbury? A vain, spiteful creature, what of her? She returned to England 2 months before my marriage to Alina. She sent me a letter. She said that if I ever dared to show happiness with another woman, she would destroy that woman's reputation. She has connections in the scandal sheets, in the gossip circles of London. She threatened to fabricate stories, to paint Alina as a scheming fortune hunter who trapped me into marriage. She would have been ruined, Mother. Her name dragged through the mud before she ever had a chance to find her footing. I could not allow it." The Dowager Duchess stared at him. "So you chose to make her miserable to protect her?" "I made the world believe I did not care," he said, his voice breaking. "If Penelope thought Alina meant nothing to me, she would have no reason to strike. She would see no victory in harming a forgotten wife. I thought I could endure being the villain if it kept Alina safe." "And the letter your wife found, the one calling her a burden?" He closed his eyes in anguish. "I wrote that in a moment of self-pity the week after our wedding. I was terrified of what I felt for her already. I knew the danger. I thought if I pushed her away early it would be easier. It was the stupidest, most cowardly act of my life. I regretted it the moment I sealed the envelope, but I could not take it back." His mother was silent for a long time. Then she said softly, "Does Alina know any of this?" "No, and she cannot. If Penelope discovers the truth, she will act. She is watching. She has spies among the servants. I am certain of it." The Dowager Duchess rose. "You have protected her from a scandal, but you have broken her heart in the process. Is that a trade you are willing to live with?" He had no answer. Neither of them noticed the slight movement in the hallway. Alina had been passing by, carrying a book when she heard her own name. She had stopped. She had listened. And now she stood frozen, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. The truth was not what she had believed. He did not hate her. He had never hated her. He had loved her desperately, and had made himself into a cold stranger to save her from a vengeful woman's poison. The revelation was a storm inside her. Anger, relief, sorrow, and a fierce, aching love all tangled together. She understood his sacrifice, but she also understood the cost. He had chosen silence when he should have chosen trust. He had decided he knew what was best for her without ever giving her a voice. And yet she could not unhear the anguish in his voice. He loved her. He had loved her all along. She did not confront him immediately. She needed to think. She needed to breathe. She retreated to her room and sat by the window, watching the gray sky, her heart a battlefield. The days that followed were strange and fragile. The Duke noticed a change in Alina's demeanor. She was no longer cold, but she was distant in a new way, as if she were watching him from across a great chasm. He felt her eyes on him, thoughtful and searching. He did not know what it meant. He only knew he was terrified. The fear crystallized into something sharper when Alina fell ill. It began as a cough, a weariness that clung to her limbs. She had insisted on visiting a tenant family stricken with a respiratory fever, despite the protests of her maid. Within 2 days she was burning with fever, her skin pale and clammy, her breathing labored. The doctor was summoned. He spoke in hushed tones of pneumonia, of the danger of the infection spreading. The Duke did not leave her bedside. He sent word to London that he would not be attending Parliament. He ignored his steward, his correspondence, his mother's worried glances. He sat in a hard wooden chair beside Alina's bed, holding her hand, his dark head bent. The servants had never seen their master like this. His face was hollow, his eyes red-rimmed. He spoke to no one. He ate only when the Dowager Duchess forced him. On the 3rd night, Alina's fever spiked dangerously. She drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring fragments of words. The doctor shook his head and said they must prepare for the worst. The Duke heard the words and something inside him shattered. He knelt beside the bed, pressing her burning hand to his lips. Tears fell unchecked onto her skin. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, please do not leave me. You cannot leave me. I have not told you. I have never told you." Her eyelids fluttered. She did not wake. "I love you," he said, the words torn from the deepest part of him. "I have loved you since you walked into this cold, empty house and tried to fill it with light. I was a coward. I was so afraid of losing you to scandal that I lost you to my own cruelty instead. But I love you. I love you with every breath I have. Please stay. Please, let me spend the rest of my life proving it." He pressed his forehead to her knuckles and wept. The sound was raw and broken, the sound of a man who had spent a lifetime hiding his heart, finally letting it bleed. He did not see her eyes open. He did not feel her other hand move, weak and trembling until her fingers brushed his hair. He looked up, startled. Her gaze was hazy with fever, but there was a light in it he had not seen in months. Her lips moved, barely a whisper. "Alexander." "I am here," he said, his voice shaking. "I am here, forgive me for all of it." She took a slow, shallow breath. "I heard you talking to your mother. I know about Penelope. I know why you pushed me away." He stared at her, shock and dread warring on his face. "You heard." "Every word." A tear slipped from the corner of her eye. "You foolish, noble, infuriating man. You should have trusted me. We could have faced her together." He lowered his head. "I was so afraid for you. I could not bear the thought of your name being dragged through the filth of London gossip. You deserved so much better." "I only ever wanted you," she whispered. "Just you, not your protection, not your sacrifice, just your heart." "You have it," he said, his voice a ragged promise. "It has always been yours, from the very beginning." She smiled, weak but real. "Then stay with me, and when I am well we will deal with Lady Penelope together. No more secrets." He nodded, unable to speak, and pressed a kiss to her forehead with a tenderness that said more than any words could. The days that followed were slow and careful. Eleanor's fever broke on the 5th morning. The Duke, who had barely slept, was there when she opened her eyes, truly awake for the first time. He looked haggard, unshaven, and more beautiful to her than he had ever been. He fed her broth with his own hands, read to her from her favorite poetry, and held her when she slept. The servants tiptoed around the sick room, witnessing a transformation they could scarcely believe. The cold master had become a devoted husband, and the lonely Duchess was finally, truly loved. When Eleanor was strong enough to sit up and take a little air in the garden, Alexander knelt beside her chair and took her hands. "I have written to my solicitor," he said. "Lady Penelope's threats are being investigated. I should have done it long ago instead of letting fear dictate my actions. She will not harm you. I will make certain of it." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes soft. "I am not afraid of her. I am only sorry we lost so much time." He lifted her hand and pressed it to his cheek. "I will spend the rest of my life giving that time back to you." The scandal, when it came, was a minor ripple. Lady Penelope, confronted with evidence of her blackmail and threats, retreated to the continent under a cloud of disgrace. The Ton whispered for a week, and then moved on to fresher gossip. The Duke and Duchess of Montcroft, it was said, had become quite inseparable. Society was baffled, then charmed. The cold Duke had apparently melted, and his quiet Duchess had blossomed into a confident, radiant woman. The following spring, Ashford Hall hosted a garden party unlike any it had seen in a decade. The lawns were filled with laughter and music. The village children ran through the hedgerows, their faces painted with joy. The tenants, invited as honored guests, mingled with the gentry. At the center of it all stood Eleanor, glowing in a gown of soft rose, her hand resting on the slight curve of her belly. Beside her, Alexander looked at her as if she were the sun itself. He leaned close, his lips brushing her ear. "Are you happy?" She turned her face up to his, her eyes shining. "More than I ever dreamed I could be." He placed his hand over hers where it rested on their unborn child. "I was a fool," he said quietly. "But I am your fool now, and I will never let you forget how loved you are." She laughed, the sound bright and free. I will hold you to that, your grace. Alexander, he corrected softly. Always Alexander. She rose on her toes and kissed his cheek, there in the sunlight in front of all their guests. The old gossips gasped. The young ones sighed. And somewhere in the village, the children from a leaner school wove daisy chains and sang a little song about the kind duchess who had taught them to read. The story of the Duke and Duchess of Montcroft would be told for years to come. A story of a love that was nearly lost to silence and fear. A story of a woman who stopped waiting and found her own strength. And a story of a man who learned, almost too late, that the coldest hearts can burn the brightest if only they have the courage to let the fire in.